And I call it the 4 dimensions of injury healing, and it's really to gain a perspective on your treatment protocols and treatment recommendations and help support what you're doing. And remember, it's your treatment protocol and recommendations, and especially your documentation and your ability to support your documentation that does 2 vital things for you. It does several things, but the reasons that you ought to be paying attention is, number one, is it establishes the need for care. Number two is it gets you paid. And obviously it helps the patient likewise. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. And so we're talking about the 4 dimensions of an injury here. So let's go ahead and take a look at him. And let's start with some really basic information. So we talk about the definition of maximum medical improvement, or MMI, and permanent injury. So these are the 2 definitions. So maximum medical improvement, or MMI, is the point at which the condition of an injured person is stabilized. No further recovery or improvement is expected, even with additional medical intervention. And we talk a lot about that, how to define MMI, and basically the definition is after, I said really the classic definition is this definition, but after the 3 phases of healing. But as an example, you would have an MMI if there was an arm amputation in the inflammation phase. So I could easily say there's MMI if there's an arm amputation and it was in the inflammation phase, because that's going to obviously be no improvement from that, and we're considering that the arm's not going to be reattached. So otherwise, you would not want to, if it's not something like that, then you would not want to call it MMI until I suggested you were at least into the repair phase of healing, and you had 2 re-exams, 2 trend lines, which showed no further subjective or objective improvement. So I have got the qualification of the subjectivity and objectivity, and it's within the appropriate time frame where I can have the least expectation of an improvement, being in the remodel phase of healing. So I would not do it in the repair phase, and I certainly would not do it in the inflammation phase. So permanency is a condition. A condition is permanent if it's believed that the condition will not change or progress. And so these are the two definitions. So obviously you would have MMI first before you would declare a permanent injury. You would have MMI, maximum medical improvement, before you would declare a permanent injury. Now, the guidelines for permanency that we talk about is after maximum medical improvement, no further recovery or improvement is expected. There's no subjective or objective changes after 12 months of the initial onset of the injury. And I talk about a minimum of 2 re-exams that show no subjective or objective improvement, preferably during the remodel phase of healing. And those are really good guidelines for MMI and permanency that you can easily explain and justify. Now, again, we're going to be paying a lot of, when we talk about the four dimensions of an injury, we're going to be looking at each of the phases. So again, we're looking at the 3 phases of healing. So we have the inflammation phase, so that's 72 hours after the injury. Now, during this phase, damaged and dead cells are cleared out, along with bacteria and other pathogens or debris. This happens through the process of phagocytosis, where white blood cells eat debris by engulfing it. Platelet-derived growth factors are released into the wound that cause the migration and division of cells during the proliferative phase. So that's the inflammation phase. Just as a reminder, and remember, all of this is leading to the 4 dimensions of an injury in substantiating and documenting and thinking about the documentation and treatment protocol for your patient. So the second, the repair, or the proliferative phase, 6 to 12 weeks after the injury, is the phase of angiogenesis, collagen deposition, granulation tissue formation, epithelialization, and wound contraction occur. In angiogenesis, vascular endothelial cells form new blood vessels, in fibroplasia and granulation tissue formation, fibroblasts grow and form a new provisional extracellular matrix by excreting collagen and fibronectin. Concurrently, reepithelialization of the epidermis occurs, in which epithelial cells proliferate and crawl atop the wound bed, providing cover for the new tissue. In wound contraction, myofibroblasts decrease the size of the wound by gripping the wound edges and contracting using a mechanism that resembles that in smooth muscle cells. When the cells rows are close to complete, unneeded cells undergo apoptosis or cell death. And so the third phase, remembering the third phase of healing, the remodel or the maturation phase from roughly 12 weeks to 12 months after the injury. This is during the maturation or remodeling. Collagen is realigned along tensile lines, and cells that are no longer needed are removed by programmed cell death. Now, those were just reminders to get us to the four dimensions of injury healing and your treatment protocols and substantiating the need for care. So, what's the first dimension of an injury? An injury will naturally progress through all phases of healing if there is no further irritant. So that's the first dimension. The second dimension. Further irritation can initiate the inflammatory process with tissue that has progressed into the repair phase, creating the inflammatory cycle while the repair cycle is in progress. And this is when we need to really pay attention that it is not black or white. It is not somebody has an injury and they go from one phase to the next with distinct factors and then they end. That is not what happens. These are tremendously overlapping potential situations. And so here we have the first overlap. So very easily you can be in the repair phase with this patient and your treatment protocol be in the repair phase. But at the same time, you can have a new initiated inflammatory process. And so it is important to document this, to document the biomarkers, but also the reason for why you're doing it. So I may be doing therapeutic protocols that are specific for the repair phase, and at the same time be doing treatment protocols that are specific for the inflammatory phase. So I have multiple. Now I have to be able to explain this. Number one is I have to be able to document it, the biomarkers. And then number two is I have to be able to explain it to justify the need for care and reimbursement. And by the way, this is what should be happening for treatment of the patient, for the best progress of the patient. So now we come to the third dimension. Further irritation can initiate the inflammatory process with tissue that has progressed into the repair phase and tissue that has progressed into the remodel phase. So these are separate and distinct cellular damage. Any injury can have all three phases of healing present in cellular tissue if there is continual irritation or exacerbation. And that is more of the norm. It is not the norm to have an injury, no further irritant at all. The person strictly go through each of the three phases of healing, and that's it. That is not the norm. And so it's not classic textbook because people have lives. They live lives. And the most common scenario is the patient re-injures. In other words, they create an inflammatory process during the repair phase of the original injury or even during the remodel phase of the original injury. So you can, at this particular point in time, you can have all three dimensions of an injury. In other words, as long as you document it and you have the biomarkers that are showing, in other words, you could be doing some therapeutic protocols that are specific for the injury in the remodel phase, the third phase of healing. In addition, you could be doing some specific therapies that the person re-injured themselves, and that injury is now in the repair phase. And you can also be doing some therapeutic protocols because there was new inflammation that the person occurred in the remodel phase. And so now you have all three dimensions occurring. You have the inflammatory process that's separate and distinct. You have the repair process that's separate and distinct. And you have the remodel process that's separate and distinct. So as long as you have the biomarkers, you can justify the therapeutic protocol and the need for care. And this is more common than not common because people live their lives. They re-injure themselves. They hurt themselves. They have accidents. And now the fourth dimension. Depending on the irritant or the exacerbation, you can have all three phases of healing taking place simultaneously, while previously injured tissue is in a separate and distinct phase at different intervals of time. In other words, you could have all three dimensions of an injury that are happening in the repair phase. You could have all three injuries that are occurring in the remodel phase. Let me start over. You can have all three phases of injury and therapeutic protocol that are occurring from the original injury that are in the remodel phase. In other words, you may need to be doing some remodel type of therapeutic protocol. That's typically strengthening and stretching, active. You could be doing some, at the same time, injury that happened in the later that's now in the repair phase of the time frame that's overlapping. So now you could be doing some active and passive range of motion therapeutic protocol. And you can have an inflammatory response going on. And so therefore be doing some anti-inflammatory treatment protocol. But what you have to be able to do is document it subjectively and objectively and be able to explain what you're doing. Now, the fourth dimension is that you not only can have it going on vertically in one of those categories, but it can be simultaneously in all three categories. In other words, you could have the inflammatory phase, the repair phase, and remember, I'm talking about separate and distinct tissue that are overlapping. So you can have the inflammatory phase and the repair phase occurring simultaneously in the remodel phase area of an injury. And then at the same time, in the repair phase, you can have the repair and inflammatory phase. And then you can have a totally new inflammatory process taking place. And so those are the four dimensions of an injury. As long as you can document the history, and so what is a common history? Let's go into a common history. Somebody hurts themselves. They're in an accident, so they have this injury. And then let's say they have to work or functions that they have to do in life. So let's say you start with your therapeutic protocol in the inflammatory phase. All your therapies are based toward reducing pain and inflammation. And then the patient moves into the repair phase, and you start shifting your therapeutic protocol to add in passive and active ranges of motion and mobility factors in your therapeutic protocol. And let's say while you're in the repair phase, the person has a re-exacerbation. In other words, of that same injury or of an overlapping injury. And so now you have an inflammatory process on top of the repair process. And all you just really need to make sure is that you document this the history of this inflammatory process and the signs and symptoms and objective findings. And that supports the need for care, your payment, and that's how the patient should be treated also. So that's a kind of a classic example. Or another example is somebody is gone through all three phases of healing and they're in the remodel phase. And so you're doing active therapies and stretching and exercising and things of that nature. And let's say they had a previous injury after the original injury, a re-exacerbation that's now in the repair phase. So you're needing to do maybe some passive range of motion work. And then they also have a concurrent inflammatory process through a re-exacerbation on, say, on the job or with their activities of daily living. And so in that particular case, at that point in time, you would have had all three. And this is very common. So it's not uncommon to have to overlap your therapeutic protocol and your treatment. And so really all we're trying to point out here is there are four dimensions to an injury. It is not linear in one dimension. And in other words, they don't have an injury and they go through inflammation and it stops, and then they go through the repair and then it stops, and then they go through remodel and then it stops. Now, I can't think of one patient I've treated in thousands of patients that was the case. It's always a second dimension, third dimension, or a fourth dimension of an injury. And so you have to have the history of that exacerbation. You have to have the signs and symptoms of that and documented. And then you have to have the biomarkers. And that is what support. And then you have to have the ability to explain it. You can easily explain, well, during this phase of healing, that's why we're doing this therapeutic protocol. And previously they had this injury, and that particular phase injuries in this phase of healing, say the repair phase, and they may have had a re-exacerbation today, which is affecting the pain and inflammation. And so there you go. That's how you can easily support and document. And that, by the way, that is a very common scenario. People live their lives. They get injured, they have re-exacerbations, they have up and downs, and that's what the re-exams are about. So the SOAP notes are day-to-day, short-term trend lines, and the re-exams are long-term trend lines. And that's what determines the need for care and your therapeutic protocol. And that's what's called the four dimensions of an injury. So the multiphasic aspect of treatment, and that's just what I talked about. So therefore the treatment can be specific to the phase of healing, in addition relevant to the time of healing. So remember, it's not just that injury and the biomarkers, but what is the time frame of that injury that you want to be paying attention to with your therapeutic protocol. And so you can have what I call vertical and horizontal healing and treatment. And that's the four dimensions of an injury. So it's the three phases of healing would be what's called horizontal, and then they could be multi-layered, which are vertical. And it could be multifaceted in any one of the three phases. And that's the four dimensions of an injury. And you justify and document treatment based on the history, subjective findings, and objective findings. That's how you get paid. That's how you establish the need for care. And I explained the example. It's possible to apply pain relief due to the inflammation phase in the remodel phase, while applying active motion therapy for the repair phase, while healing during the remodel time frame, while applying rehabilitation therapy for strength and mobility during the remodel time frame. All three forms of therapy can be used during the third phase of healing, or the remodel, or the third phase of healing, or the remodel phase, if the history, subjective, and objective biomarkers are present and undocumented.